I think there it is. Here we go. We're live. So this isn't being live streamed, is it? I don't need to welcome anybody. Oh, welcome. Welcome to Eastside. You bet. Yes, I am. I'm Fred. I just got caught in the dryer. So Fred's not here tonight. He's home not feeling well, so I'm sure he would appreciate your prayers. And Fred and I have been talking about me doing this for the better part of 2 years. We've struck up a really good friendship. I think everybody knows that I was a pastor for 32 years, and in the last 20 years I've been doing some stuff around in the arena of church missions. And my journey was much like Fred's in that some things that happened in my pastoral ministry forced me to question some things that, whereas Fred's was primarily in a theological way, mine came, and I may have some time to unpack this with you over the next 3 weeks, but mine came in large part through a crisis of prayer, of me trying to make sense. So, as Fred talks about a lot of passages in the Old Testament about a judgmental God and those kinds of things that we kind of chafe at a little bit. Where I found myself completely lost was at many of the passages about prayer. Because quite frankly, I didn't see prayer change things in the lives of the people that I was working with in some of the challenged communities on the south side of Chicago, in the Philippines, and various places like that. And so, either way, God has a way of taking these things, and I think if we're truthful about them in our lives, and we're willing to lean into them little by little, He begins to reveal to us the things that do make sense. And my faith is stronger today than it's ever been, and I have answers to those dilemmas. Maybe we'll have some time to talk a little bit about the way in which prayer played into that whole thing. But what I want you to know is, hey, Bonnie! Okay, I don't want to... Bonnie. No, don't be sorry. We're just glad you're here, both of you. So this is going to be a 3-week workshop together. And I mean to spend some time towards the end with Q&A and those sort of things. And I want this to be a conversation. I want to unpack some stuff with you. Because here's what I found in the work that I've been doing with churches for the last 20 years. We call it Missions 3.0. And the reason we call it Missions 3.0 is we don't want to leave the impression that missions has been bad or wrong. I am not saying that. So when we talk about toxic charity or when helping hurts, or we talk about the things that we've done through missions that have been less than what they could be, I am not pointing the finger. As a matter of fact, I would say to you that we've had to do missions the way we've done missions in order to get to this point. And now we're at this point. And I believe that God is saying and giving the church the opportunity to iterate another idea of what it means to do missions in our world. And I believe that God wants the church to be at the forefront. So we call it Missions 3.0 simply because what we have found, and you may find this in your own experience as well, is that in almost any church that I have worked with or talked with historically, it always follows these 3 stages. They're a new church or an early church where they're working on missions, and the first thing that they do is they put together a mission committee, and that mission committee is responsible for a mission budget. And that mission committee then is responsible to vet all of the requests. And there's always more requests than you have money. And so in many ways, the mission committee is sort of like the board of a foundation trying to figure out who we're going to give our money to. But eventually, every church I've ever known gets bored with just writing a check and then assigning 8 people to decide where to spend that money, and they start saying, well, we call that Missions 1.0. And during Missions 1.0, what the church typically teaches its people is how to be generous stewards of the resources that they have. And that is absolutely correct. But we eventually get bored with just writing a check. And so then we said, I know what the missions committee, we're going to start vetting all of the mission opportunities that we have based on volunteer experience. We don't just want to write a check. We want to build a relationship with that church or that mission partner, right? You been there? Let's build, because the church is supposed to be about relationships. So how do we build relationships? So now all of a sudden the mission committee is vetting the mission opportunities that we have based on whether or not they provide a volunteer experience for the people of our church. That's Mission 2.0. Now we're not just mobilizing money, we're mobilizing human resources, or we're mobilizing people, right? But then here's a funny thing that happens. Eventually, we start building relationships with these ministry partners that we're working with as a church. And some of them are, if you're a church that's doing the Acts 1:8 in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world, then maybe a church has a mission partner in India, like you guys do here. And you end up valuing being able to have some sort of relationship. But even the local ones, what begins to happen is you see the same people. We're just being honest here, right? And it's like you go on a mission trip and you come back and you end up saying to yourself, okay, there was money involved, there was volunteerism involved, there was relationship involved, but you end up asking this very honest question: did we really do anything lasting? Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about the gospel to the extent that you can share the gospel, but you know what I know? I know that in virtually every mission experience that I've ever had, the indigenous people that we were missioning with, whether I'm talking about the south side of Chicago or the Philippines, you know what? The gospel was already there. The gospel was already in most every mission context you and I have ever stepped into to do mission work. There are indigenous people. Now, if you've been in the 1040 window, or if you've been in places where the gospel has not reached the least reached people, okay, maybe. But that's certainly not most of the United States, and it's not most of the world. What I'm saying is that the lasting gospel that we mean to preach is represented in almost every one of the mission opportunities that you and I go into. It's important, it's valuable, but we cannot ignore the fact that the kinds of injustices, the kinds of poverty that we see in the context of most mission contexts, we're not doing anything. We're not seeing it change. And so we get bored and burned out with what we call Mission 2.0. So just like your computer, I mean, I don't know if you go, I had a baby Mac. No, not a baby Mac. Whatever those little PC Juniors way back in the 80s. You know what I'm saying? And every year, they keep upgrading the system and upgrading the system and upgrading the system. And that's all we're trying to suggest here, that within church missions, we need to upgrade. We needed to move from just giving money to doing human resources as well as financial resources. And then Missions 3.0 is we begin to ask ourselves, and here it is. It's not just about giving money. It's not just about a volunteer experience. It's about creating the structures and strategies for sustainable change. Now, right off the bat, you see how complicated that got? I mean, here's money. Take out your checkbook, please. Write a check. Everybody here understands that. Next week, we've got a volunteer experience. Be here at 6 o'clock, and here's what we're going to do. Everybody in the room knows that. Mission 1.0, Mission 2.0. Now I'm saying Mission 3.0 is we've got to create the structures and the strategies to create sustainable change. He's like, wow, that's some double talk. But it's not, is it? You know what I'm saying. And the way I've described it is that we're moving from simple math to the calculus of compassion. It's a calculator problem. It's a calculus problem, I mean. And that God has given the people in this room incredible brains to do incredible things. And it's a wide spectrum of things that people in this room can do. But within the body of Christ are people who know how to figure things out. There are people who think in terms of scale. How do we scale this? And they think in terms of how do we get to sustainable change? And not all of us think that way. So please don't hear me saying that we all have to start thinking like engineers. and business-minded people. But what I am saying is that until we make room in our mission work for the engineers and the business-minded people, we will not be able to tackle Missions 3.0. And I'm going to give you some examples of some places in this country and around the world that are pushing into this space. But then the work that I've done with churches and what we hope to be able to do here at Eastside is to go on a journey, because the things I'm going to talk about over the next 3 weeks do not happen in a 3-week workshop. All I'm going to be able to do in the next 3 weeks is give you a framework by which this can be done. And any place where the church has made some progress on it, it's taken them 2 to 3 years to change some of those things. And it's taken 3 to 5 years to change the whole DNA of the church. So if any of the stuff that I'm going to talk about over the next 3 weeks makes sense to you, and if the church were to decide that they really wanted to do something like this, guess what? It's going to take you 3 to 5 years. But here's the point. You're going to spend the next 3 to 5 years doing something. What if you could spend the next 3 to 5 years moving things to the point where you could begin to get your head around, we could begin to discover what it might look like to partner up and to bring the resources of this church to bear upon the kinds of things that could actually help people create sustainable change in their life. So nothing's going to get solved tonight. Even less is going to get solved next week. And nothing will be solved by the 3rd week. Fair enough? You see why I don't charge for this workshop? So here's what I want you to understand. I'm going to give you a little background on this and begin to lay the framework for this, begin to lay the idea, and I'm going to give you a 15-minute, you're going to see a little video in a minute. Oh, here's my watch, because there's no, gotcha. And I want to leave about the last 15 minutes for Q&A in there. But I need to give you a little bit of background of how this started to come about. And in your handout right here, the first statement I make is the North American church could play a significantly different role in tackling difficult problems through missions, or what we call charity, if it was willing to make one major shift. And that major shift is if we are willing to move the end goal. Now, I would suggest to you that most mission has an end goal of something less than what I'm calling self-sustaining change. And this really came to life in my own work probably about 15 years ago. So I was working with a number of churches around the greater Kansas City area. And in the sermon I preached on Sunday, I told you that there was a huge move that for the last 40 years or so, we have moved towards asset-based community development, looking at strengths-based versus needs-based, and we learned a lot of things. And we were working in a thing called the Co-op, something that Significant Matters, the ministry that I run, had put together. And what we were doing is we were partnering together with suburban churches like Church of the Resurrection, you know, that little United Methodist church, and some other major kind of anchor churches like Indian Creek Community Church over in Olathe, Westside Family, Colonial Presbyterian. I mean, these are major suburban churches in the greater Kansas City area. And then we were also working with some African American churches in the inner city. Most predominantly, we were working with Paseo Baptist. And if you're familiar at all with the Kansas City area, I mean, there are some stalwart churches in the African American community. One of those, Pastor Briscoe. What a wonderful man Pastor Briscoe was. I mean, he started pastoring back in the 60s, and he's no longer with us. But Pastor Briscoe pastored Paseo Baptist for decades and decades and decades. And in comes, as he got to the retirement age, a young man named Greg Ely. And so Pastor Ely came in to begin to pastor Paseo Baptist. And Greg Ely was wrestling with the same thing too. He was trying to figure out how could the church work together to change the quality of life for people that lived within walking distance of Paseo Baptist. Now that's a good idea, wouldn't it be? Not just how can we just give people a tract, how can we just give them a meal, how can we just tell them about Jesus and then go, but what if we could change the quality of life for the people that live within walking distance of Paseo Baptist? So I was able to pull together these very large Anglo churches in the suburbs. And we came and we started meeting at the First Watch there in Westport. because we had people coming from various parts of the city. And twice a month, these leaders, Jonathan Bell, mission pastor at Church of the Resurrection, Matt Adams over at Westside Family, and they would come, and we made this commitment that we would come together until we could figure out a way to work together that made sense for everybody at the table. So the Anglos in the room said, we are not going to come here with ideas of how to change your neighborhood, Greg Ely, Pastor Ely. We're not going to do it. And we'll just keep coming and having lunch together, and we'll keep talking about some things to do. We met together for 2 years. I'm telling you, that about drove me crazy. Because I'm wired like everybody, most everybody. You know, let's get something going. What are we here for? But there was this deep commitment. I was not going to be the hero in Pastor Ely's community. And I was going to sit at that table with him for as long as it took before we could eventually come to some idea that we would work together. And after 2 years, do you know what happened? At one of those lunch meetings, Pastor Ely now, we'd built a relationship. The Anglo pastors and the African American pastors at the table. And Pastor Ely said, okay, I'm going to say it. I'm just going to say it. He said, I am sick and tired of being a positive volunteer experience for rich white folks from the suburbs. Whoa. And folks, and this is the God moment in it all. And right across the table from him was my good friend Jonathan Bell, the mission pastor at the largest United Methodist church in the world. And Jonathan looked up and he said, and I'm sick and tired of feeling like an ATM machine every time I walk in the room. Now you tell me if there's not a better description of the dynamics, the realities. I didn't see that coming. I didn't see it coming. But as I sat there, I thought to myself, holy moly, that's it. I mean, that's the tension that we're living in, isn't it? And boom, something happened in that room. And we looked at each other, and it was such a feeling of solidarity between the Anglos and the African Americans in the room, the leaders in the room, in which we were all on equal ground, and that everybody had the freedom to speak truthfully. Jonathan Bell does feel like an ATM machine every time he walks into a room. And Greg Ely does feel like his major role is to provide a positive volunteer experience for folks that look like you and me. So then the question was, and one of them asked the question, said, okay, is anybody leaving? And we looked around the table at each other and said, I'm here. I'm staying. I'm staying. I'm staying. I'm staying. And we worked for another 6 months to come up with a statement of what then might we work together for. If our goal, if we're not going to work together to simply provide a positive volunteer experience for rich white folks from the suburbs, and if we're not going to partner together in order for you to have access to an ATM machine, then what are we going to do together? And it took us 6 months to finally articulate, we're going to work together to change the quality of life for those people who live within walking distance of Paseo Baptist Church. And I still hold to this day that there's not a better mission that churches across these ethnic, cultural, suburb, urban core could work together. And so out of that grew this idea of a co-op. And so we began to do some work together with Bob Lupton. If you haven't read the book Toxic Charity, I really encourage you to get the book, because we may want to spend a little bit of time talking about that either next week or the week after. But we began to look at some of the stuff that Bob Lupton was doing in there, and we began to do some stuff that would have to do with social services within an area, but also cradle to career education, home ownership, economic development, and some things like that. Now, you can see already that when you do that, it started to get complicated. Before it was all done, we ended up having to build a partnership with Mazuma Credit Union in order to get somebody with a felony record to be able to get into a house. We mobilized people from the different suburban churches to work on houses and to come up with the difference between what it would cost to rehab that house and what this person could afford. I mean, it got complicated, but here's the good news. And I know that in this room, I don't know hardly anybody here, but I guarantee you that within this room right here, there are people who already get the kind of things I'm talking about. Their mind's already going and say, yeah, but yeah, and. And then I know that this too. There's other people in here, all you want to do is hold little babies. Okay? There's no right or wrong in this, folks. There are some of you in this room who your heart is so darn big. I mean, you just want to do those kinds of relational things that are loving on people. And then there's others in this room that loving on people, I'm not quite wired that way, but I know how to fix things. I know how to structure things in such a way. I know how to think through the complex sort of things. And here's what I'm saying is that in the body of Christ, there is this wonderfulness. If we begin to make room for one another and to begin to explore what I'm calling the calculus of compassion, we can begin to iterate. We can begin to find some things that could work. But I tell you, there's not a lot of it out there. And we were making some wonderful progress until COVID hit. And when COVID hit, you know what happened? I watched most of the work that I had done in the 15 years leading up to that go away overnight, because you know what churches began to do? Their number one priority was to figure out how to deliver the Sunday morning service online. And again, what else could it do? That's it. And then all the churches that were trying to think through how to work through the complexities of this calculus of compassion rolled it all the way back to doing the stuff that they had been doing before, the kind of helping that hurts. So we lost a ton of ground since COVID, but I still believe that that the church is meant to do these things. So then, as we were doing this co-op thing, we were also working with UMKC. This is so cool how when you got these players together, we were able to cross that secular sacred divide. We had these churches. We were unapologetically a group of churches working to create a better way of life within walking distance of an individual church, so we never tried to hide that. But we then began to work with the real estate department at UMKC and different staff at UMKC as a part of this integrated approach that had cradle-to-career education, home ownership, social services, and economic development. Those are the things that would improve the quality of life within walking distance of that church. So how do we start pulling together people from our churches that could work on different committees and those things? How could we begin to see what some of the best and kind were out there? How could we over time begin to bring some of these things to work? So UMKC has a great social entrepreneurship program, and every year they have these colleges with social entrepreneurship program. They meet somewhere around the United States, and they put on a big old conference, and they talk about the things that the school is trying to do around justice and helping and making a difference. And they'd heard about the co-op, and they'd heard about what was going on with the UMKC department with real estate. And so they asked the real estate department to co-present with the co-op at this UMKC. It was at the Kauffman Center. And we were presenting to all of these entrepreneurial programs, social entrepreneurial programs around the United States. So I was going to get to stand on the stage at the Kauffman Center. Maybe I will charge for this next time. And it was a wonderful thing. And we never, ever thought that we needed to hide who we were. We were area churches motivated by our relationship with Jesus Christ to do these things that were very tangible, to create a better way of life for those that lived within walking distance, not of Church of the Resurrection, but of Paseo Baptist. So on the screen behind me as I stood up there, there was the co-op, and the co-op, the whole room was looking out, and it had a little mission statement, and we intentionally put church and Jesus in it. Just because we're not going to hide who we are. We believe that within our church we have people who can provide practical help for the kinds of things that could do that. So we weren't shoving Jesus down anybody's face. And I decided to do something. I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be the end or the beginning. I said, here's what I'm doing. I am going to create a secular value proposition for why this was not a Christian group. So I'm talking now to entrepreneurship schools across the United States. And I stood up and I said, if I were an atheist, and just paused, and Jesus and the church was up there with the mission statement, and I just let that sink in for a minute. I said, if I were an atheist, now I'm not, but if I were, I'd still want to work with the church in this way. And let me tell you 4 reasons why. First of all, the church is and you can fill in the notes here if you want. The church is the greatest mobilizer of money, donated dollars, for the disenfranchised. We are the greatest mobilizer of donated dollars. And I said, you know what? There's no way that we're going to be able to right some of the wrongs and create some of the solutions that we're trying to talk about without money. And we're not going to get it from the government. There, I just gave my bias away. And it's going to require people with generous hearts to be willing to do this. And I watched across the room. Now, I expect this group to shake your head and that sort of stuff. But I wasn't sure. But I watched across that room and people shook their head. They could all agree, no matter who they were, they could all agree that, yes, you're right. There's no other subset on the planet that raises as much money for the disenfranchised, for the poor, for the hungry, for the marginalized people than the church. Reason number 1. Reason number 2, church is the greatest mobilizer of human resources, volunteers in the world. And again, I watched the crowd just shake their head. Because they know it. And I said, you know what? We're not going to solve some of these problems by paying people market rate to be able to do it. It's going to require donated dollars. It's going to require donated time. Mission 1.0, Mission 2.0. And everybody in the whole room shook their heads. Yeah, church is pretty good, mobilizing volunteers. I said, number 3, because it's in the DNA of the church. Think about it, folks. You tell me any other group in which the leader of that group stands in front of them 52 times a year and preaches to them, sometimes with heavy doses of guilt. Things like, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Or the Good Samaritan. You tell me in any other association that has built into its DNA, your job, our job is to care for the disenfranchised. And I saw heads across the room just shake their heads. Yeah, that's true. I'm thinking, this is going good. And the 4th reason is the church has the greatest delivery system in the world. There's a church on every corner. And whether you're liberal, conservative, or something other, all those churches care about the struggling. And then I simply ask this question. Listen. If the church could be as good at creating sustainable solutions, if the church could be as good at helping to create the structures and strategies by which we can help lift people out of poverty, wouldn't you want to work with them? And I'm watching all across the Kaufman Center. Heads are nodding yes. And afterwards, I had people come up to me and, in a wonderful sort of way, start talking about, you know what? You're exactly right. If that's what the church is doing. And then I was doing the same conference down in Alabama. What's that town that's kind of like the second NASA? Huntsville. I was in Huntsville, Alabama, and those people are brainiacs down there. And I was doing this conference, and afterwards, some people came up and talked to me, and there was this lady that was this young lady in her 60s that came up to me, And she waited her turn, and when everybody else, she said, "Thank you." And I said, "For what?" She said, "For including me." Well, now, how did I include you? And then she almost whispered, "I am an atheist." And I said, and you know what? My pastor heart just jumped up and down. I said, oh. I said, you know what? I get you. I get you. You know, you believe this is all there is in life. And I get why, if you believed this life was it, why you would give heart and limb to make sure that others didn't live without. And I tell you, and I said, I admire you. But you know what I would love? I'm telling you, this isn't all there is. And there's a God who loves you and still wants you to work for the good of these folks. And then I said, and by the way, I am not going to let a secular humanist outwork me on this. And I feel that way. And we had a wonderful conversation, and I got to share my faith with her, and I don't know where she's at, but you know what? She didn't have any tension. She saw somebody that believed that God cares as much about the here and now as he does the hereafter, and that we're willing to mobilize the resources of our world to bear upon the needs of other people in ways that get them to a place where they no longer need our help. And I have found that same thing happen over and over and over again. And I find that the secular world is dying for churches willing to step into this space. And that churches people appreciate a church that's trying to do some of these kinds of things. So there's a wonderful little quote there from Harry Emerson. What's his name? And you can read it. But I do want to get through this much, and if we have time, I'm going to show you a video. If not, I'm just going to tell you to watch it, because I do want to spend some time with some Q&A. And it's 7:02. We're doing good. So here's the framework that I need you to begin to understand, because I am now going to start parsing out. If you understand this whole world of missions, then it will help you later on as a church to begin to come back and say, okay, what are we doing? And here's the other thing that's going to do. It's going to create a common language. So I really don't care what your definitions are. My definitions are the only definitions that matter in this particular thing. Now, if you want to change them later on, you can, but what I'm suggesting is that when a church is willing to come around a common framework with common language, then you can begin to create solutions. But if we have to keep debating the words and all of this sort of stuff, you never get anywhere. So, this is what it is. So here's what we found out, that in the world, this didn't come from us. This has come from these other folks that I've talked about, the Luptons. Lots of people have suggested that when it comes to helping, there are three different types of helping, and you have to begin to think in terms of these three different kinds of helping. The first one is what we would call emergency relief. So I'm going to give them all three to you, and then I'm going to come back, because you can see, and we've got a whole nice little diagram over here that goes into it a little more in detail. But the first is that there's this whole slate of things that we do through missions that we would call emergency relief. Remember Haiti? Remember Katrina? Emergency relief. The second category is what we would call individual betterment. And individual betterment are typically, those are things that we would say are capacity building. So anything that you do that helps a person build their capacity so they can do more. So tutoring programs is an individual betterment thing. Back snacks is a relief thing. You see why? You see the difference there? Okay, and then the third category we just call sustainable development. And I'll take just a minute here. We'll go through this thing here. But here's what I got to say. Here's the other thing that we began to hear from African American churches in particular. They were saying, listen, you guys don't understand this, but by prioritizing a positive volunteer experience for folks from the suburbs, basically what you require of us are one of two things, either a relief program or a betterment program. That's you need us to continue to give you a constant supply of relief volunteer experiences or betterment volunteer experiences. And I've heard churches overseas tell me, you have no idea, they painted our kindergarten room 5 times this year. Because that's what you and I could do on that trip. And they knew that if they gave us that kind of an experience, we might write a check at the end for which they could actually do something that they wanted to do. Okay? So the first thing that a church has to do is you have to be able to begin to look at all the mission work that you do in the categories of relief, betterment, or development. And then as we work with churches, we go through an initial process of having them take all the money that they give and all of the volunteer hours that they give and put them into the 3 categories. How much of your volunteer dollars, your dollars and your volunteer time is spent in relief, betterment, and development. And every single church, they move everything that they do, at least 50% of it, over to development. And I'd say, now you're just lying. Now think with me. Is that really development? And you do this kind of gut check. Again, remember, there's no right and wrong here, folks. It's not good or bad. It's until you're willing to do the hard assessment of looking at the things that you do, you won't be able to figure out, okay, what do we need to do differently? So look at these things real quick. Look on this page right here, and you can see we've made a list of things. We finally had to do this so that as churches began to evaluate what they're doing, we're saying, okay, now you need to see, is this program that you're doing a relief, a betterment, or development? Well, in the relief, the definition is providing emergency aid to reduce temporary suffering from a crisis. What's the focus? Acute needs. What's the target? Everyone. What's the dynamic? Listen to it. One-way giving. You just give to the people in Haiti. Jump over to the next category. When you're into the area of individual betterment, what's the dynamic? It's one-way giving and sweat equity. Or there is an expectation that they participate. So if it's a tutoring program, you've got people coming in to volunteer, but there's an expectation that that student or if it's a financial literacy class, you see what I'm saying? There's an expectation that is placed into individual betterment. Jump over to the next one. Dynamic. What's the dynamic and sustainable development? It's reciprocal exchange. Now, all I'm asking you to do right now is look at these things. Think about them. Take this home with you and look at how things change, the dynamics and what goes on in relief. If you get down towards the bottom, what's the metrics of success in relief? The number of people served. The number of meals served, the number of backpacks given away. It's all the number of, in the individual betterment, metrics of success are people equipped. Do you see the difference? I gave X number of meals away. Now, don't hear me saying that giving meals away is a bad thing, necessarily. It might be, but not giving meals might be just as bad. Can you see that? I believe that what God is saying, come on, folks, we can think. Let's think. How do we do these things in such a way that we don't create dependencies? Look at the third one, metrics of success, a person's or a community's quality of life and the ability to sustain it. Now, when you start measuring that, do you just see how all of a sudden good that feels? I mean, that's theirs to own. You help that man get into home ownership, and it's his home. Something has changed. So the first area, the first piece of the framework is to understand that there are these 3 types of helping that goes on. Yeah, we're doing good. Let's go to the key stakeholders. Now remember, I'm just giving you the skeleton here. We get to put flesh on this over the next 3 to 5 years. Here we go. So who are the key stakeholders? Well, there are 4 stakeholders in the world of missions. And this came to me because as I was doing this early on, I had some really neat opportunities to work with some rather large churches. And there was a group of large church mission pastors that met up at that other little church up in the Chicago area called Willow Creek. Remember that one? So, because I was associated with Church of the Resurrection and doing some stuff with Jonathan, I also got invited into this thing where I went up there. And so now I'm in this meeting with some of the largest mission pastors across the country. And just previously to this, I had been in a conversation with the Global Impact Network out of the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, I'm just dropping all kinds of names on you today, aren't I? They were trying to do some stuff around the idea of impact investing. And this now was a long time ago, 15 years ago. And in my conversation with the lady there, I said, if you had the opportunity to present to a group of mission pastors from the 10 largest churches in the United States around impact investing, so how can we invest to create an impact in sub-Saharan Africa such that you can give people the means by which to lift themselves out of poverty? If you could speak to a group of the 10 largest mission pastors of the largest church in the United States, would you even be interested? She said, would I? So again, I'm just kind of jump up and down happy because I'm being told that the church is irrelevant, that the world as a whole isn't interested in what the church has to say, but I'm finding over and over again that when we come to the world that is seriously trying to solve some of these problems, that if we will mobilize who we have, and we got smart people in this room. I don't know how smart you are. Most of you look smart. And the church has the ability to do these. So they let me Skype her in. And we Skyped her in, and she was talking to these mission pastors about things that they're doing with global with impact investing and various things like that. And brilliant men and women sitting around this table listen to this lady out of the Rockefeller Foundation for 25 minutes. And when it was over, they had no questions. And I thought, that's it? You're talking with somebody from the Rockefeller Foundation. And I remember going back to my hotel room that night, and I was just throwing a fit to the Lord, calling these mission pastors names, for which if I were Catholic, I would have had to go to confession. Anyhow, I put on my big boy pants, and I said, Lord, all right, there's got to be more going on here than what meets the eye. So help me just to calm down a second. Help me see what's going on. And he did. Oh my gosh, in that moment, it was like he said to me, Tom, make it personal. You know what it's like to lead a church. You know what it's like to try to get things to happen. He said, these are brilliant men and women here, but guess what? They are worn out, and I'll tell you why they're worn out. It's because these mission pastors have to manage 4 different stakeholders, and all 4 of those stakeholders in the world of missions are in competition with each other. And I began to think, you're right. I mean, the first stakeholder in the world of missions is the volunteer. It's folks like you and me. And what is the volunteer? And so, well, let me just go through them. These are the stakeholders. The volunteer, who has their own set of expectations of what missions should be like. Then there's the resource church, right? That's the pastor and the leadership of the church who is trying to cast vision for what our mission is going to look like. And then the church puts in charge a mission pastor who has to make sure that the board is happy with the decisions that they've made and has to make sure that the volunteers are having a positive volunteer experience. And then the mission pastor has to build with the third category, which is their partners. Because you're not going to do this stuff in India by yourself. You're not going to do this stuff in the urban core by yourself. So they have to go build a relationship with the mission partner. And then the fourth stakeholder in the whole thing is the individual or the community itself. And I began to think, oh my gosh, that's exactly it. This poor mission pastor who's part of the Resource Church, who has resources to give, is getting a phone call from some lady that's saying, listen, Jim, who is the mission pastor, listen, Jim, my husband just started coming to church with me this week, and if we could just get him into a positive volunteer experience sometime in the next couple of weeks, and he really loves to do hands-on kinds of stuff, and we really need for it to be on Saturday morning because we want it to be part of this kind of family sort of a thing, but I've got kids in volleyball and another one in soccer. Is there any way in the world in which you could create a positive volunteer experience for my husband? Because if you did, he'd probably start coming back to church. I guarantee you some version of that has happened to every mission pastor in the country. Now, was the wife who's trying to get her husband to come to church in the wrong for wanting to use volunteerism to get him there? No, not at all. But can you see how the mission pastor who's paid to work with volunteers feels the pressure from the Resource Church to respond to her? Now, he's also built a relationship with the partnership out here. And the partnership has said to him, hey guys, we're not going to use the video today, so don't worry about that. The partners have also said, if they've been honest, the partners have said to them, you need to understand, your need for me to provide you a positive volunteer experience is wearing my staff out. And the mission pastor is saying, yeah, I know, but I'm not sure I can maintain this partnership if I can't give numbers back to my board. Is the board wrong? Is the church wrong? Is the mission pastor out of line? Is the partner? Because the partner lives in the community, and that partner knows what the community members. And the fourth stakeholder is the individual or the community itself. And do you think the community or the individual that you're trying to help gives a flip about a positive volunteer experience for folks like you and me? They don't. They're hungry, they're tired, they're broken, they're looking for a way out. All right, now I hope that messes you up a little bit, because the reason I have to go here is because if we can't admit the tension that exists in this space, and that all four of those stakeholders belong, volunteers belong in this conversation. The question is, how do we manage that? How do we build our mission work such that volunteerism does not create unintended consequences for the partners and the fourth stakeholder, the community itself? And folks, it's not easy, but it can be done. And not only that, it has to be done. And so these mission pastors had no time to talk with the folks up at the Rockefeller Center, because they were trying to just figure out how to keep all of those stakeholders from killing each other. And most of the mission pastors that I've come to know have spent enough time in the community and with the indigenous partners, the folks with boots on the ground that are doing it, to know that the answers are more complicated, and that the average volunteer experience for most churches is not significantly helping what that ministry is doing. Now, I want to come back and say this. Are there any bad guys in this story? No. Please don't hear me say that. But unless we can be brutally honest, with this framework. So what I'm saying is that in the framework of missions, you have three types of service. You have, I can do this, don't help me. Yeah. I'm sorry. You have emergency relief, you have individual betterment, and you have sustainable development. Those are the three types of service. And that as churches begin to think in those three types, as you begin to figure out who to partner with to do those kinds of things and how to create new things in there and create a continuum, then you can begin to solve these things. The other thing that is part of your framework in any church is you have volunteers, and we as volunteers have a role to play. And the answer isn't just shut up and do what we tell you to do. That's not the answer. So how you unpack that, and we'll spend some time doing that there is the Resource Church. The Resource Church has to wrestle with stewardship issues and stories so that you can mobilize more money and more volunteers. And you have to have partners. Partners are the ones who are working in the indigenous space. They are the ones that know what really is happening there, and they're the ones that control such things that we don't end up going in and doing more harm than good out of our misunderstanding of the realities there. And then the fourth stakeholder is the person themselves or the community that you're trying to help. Those are the stakeholders. Now, there's other things in here. We will get through this whole worksheet in 3 weeks. But that's all we're going to get through today, because I was going to stop at 7:29 and leave the rest of the time for questions. But I stopped at 7:20, and so we're just getting started. But does this make a little bit of sense? And I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for it. So, questions, anybody, and Nate's got a microphone. I would love to answer your question. And if I don't know the answer, probably Bonnie does. No, I'll leave Bonnie alone. Okay, questions, anybody? Out loud. Yes, hold it. Nate's gonna. Hey, and would you do me a favor real quick, in just a sentence or so, why did you come to this tonight? And then ask your question. What made you decide to come to hear this?
Well, frankly speaking, I've been out of college long enough I actually want to hear a lecture again.
Okay, good.
And beyond that, one of the books I was forced to read had a very similar thesis to Toxic Charity. It was called Jihad versus McWorld. And it discussed the sort of brutal tension that exists between the secular world and the sacred, and how if you really whittle them down to the same soul that all humans carry, they are still trying to do the same thing. In your experience, what would you say, apart from time, was the catalyst of getting those two forces to actually work together for something greater?
And the two forces being, in this case, was it Jihad McWorld?
Yes.
So yeah, so you're talking about kind of the jihad world, or the religious world that tends to motivate through religious narrative and those kinds of stuff. McWorld being capitalism?
Well, or even beyond that, the premise of the book is more or less the great argument between moving forward to a somewhat more homogeneous culture and identity as a species, brand recognition, access to markets, this sort of bigger mentality, versus why can't this section of the world stay special? What if this group does not want to change? Yeah. Should we try to force them to?
Yeah, good question. And you know what, this really is an interesting conversation that's going on, and there's some brilliant people out there that are having conversations around this area. So let me start here. There's kind of a long answer to this. I would argue that if you get the anthropology wrong, you're going to get the solutions wrong. And so it kind of comes back to an anthropological, what is man? What is mankind? And what is it that we share in common regardless of our cultures and that sort of stuff. So I would argue that deeply embedded in the soul of everybody is this need for dignity and this sense of agency and the ability to be able to do these things. I happen to believe that the Christian narrative, the Christian story, gives the best framework for understanding the anthropological man and deep soulful issues like dignity and agency and those sorts of things. So then as we start to work those things out, then we have to start asking questions about, okay, if I'm bringing resources in to help this indigenous place that is not as far along in the progress sort of thing, what is the most dignified thing to do? And the most dignified thing to do is not try to figure out a way. I live in Johnson County, so let me just use that. The most dignified thing to do in the Philippines is not to somehow figure out how those people can get to Johnson County, 3-car garage, or whatever it is that we define as success in this country. I mean, we are here, we have what we have, and we are meant to be good stewards of that in this context. But can we slow the roll in our work with folks? And I love what Poverty Cure, it's another group that I would really encourage you to look. If we had more time, we'd watch the film Poverty Inc. But I love what the Poverty Cure folks say. They say that people are poor, or you're talking about progress, people are less progressed, not because they lack money, they would say, but because they lack access to networks of exchange. So if you came out of that space, that should really trigger you, and you're thinking, you're right. People are, let's just use poverty right now, let's just use those kind of things, is that there are an equal number of entrepreneurs in every context of poverty as there are right here in this community. It's about 10%. Entrepreneurism is there. The difference is, folks like you and I, we have access to networks of exchange. We have access to capital. We have access to the kinds of things that we would need in order to act on that. People in poverty don't have access to it. They don't have access to capital. They don't have access to the kinds of things that they would need in order to, and here's the point, progress at their own pace in their own way. And much of what we have to do in that third category is ask and answer the question, how do we mobilize and deploy resources in such a way that people can lift themselves out of poverty? Because most people that are living in deep poverty don't want yours or my version of what we're shooting for right now. Does that make sense? Someone else. Yes.
Hey, so I've heard you talk about a lot of the sustainable development. I've heard you talk about the characteristics like the long term, the handoff, the extracting ourselves from having to be in this constant cycle of providing the bulk of the resources for these communities. What does the exit strategy, what does the handoff actually look like?
So I would argue that there isn't a handoff. In fact, if a church starts down this route, the first thing that you do is you create indigenous partnerships. So it's not about you or me or anything coming into a community and setting something up and then at some point handing it off. Now there might be a case every once in a while, but by and large that's a broken system. But what you do is you find the assets within that community that have the capabilities of developing the thing, whatever it is, and you let those indigenous leaders tell you what the next thing or the first thing should be. So we did what we did with Paseo Baptist because Greg Ely finally said, you know what would change things in this community? If people in my community saw Paseo Baptist as being involved in changing the quality of life for people within walking distance. And so what we said then is, Greg, we will not be the hero in your community. Whatever is done in Paseo, no matter how much resources came from Church of the Resurrection, it will always be through you. So that, in essence, there really was never a handoff there. We were there to support them. A lot more work. It's a ton more work. Because in some of these communities, folks have been struggling without resources, and then the trust that they don't have towards outsiders coming in trying to help takes a while to build. So it's 7:29. Do we have time for one more? Oh, he said 4 more. No, he didn't. I'm only kidding. 1 more. Yes.
Okay. I have a heart for children.
She has a heart for children.
Okay. So I believe when it comes to school supplies, and that might be the only meal that they get for
Yep.
the day.
She's talking about school supplies, and the only meal of the day is the back snack and so forth. Go ahead.
I believe that a child needs to have the resources of new school supplies, pencils, pens, crayons,
Right.
headphones, and all that to succeed.
Right.
They are our future.
Right.
Teenagers need to know how to budget, what a credit card is, how you get in trouble, all that.
Yep.
So these are things that should be taken care of by parents, but they're not. So when you say that we need to teach them to stand on their own, it's not the child's fault that this is happening to them.
Right.
So how would you go about, besides just giving,
Yep.
which whenever I find a classroom that needs help, I give, because
Right.
I believe they need that, and they need to succeed.
So, and your name is?
Sandra.
Sandra. So Sandra, she's talking about the very real things, that children are in need of all of these things. Sometimes the food they get in the back snack program is going to be part of what they eat during the weekend. Got it. All those sorts of things. And the answer is, it's not a short answer. You're right. Children should not suffer because their parents can't step up to it. But part of what we have done in this efforts to help the children is we have further destroyed the sense of self-image that many men in particular in the urban core feel about themselves. And we'll pick this up next week, because the answer isn't to punish the children. It's not. But I've had dads say to me, because of the Christmas stuff that we brought into their homes, and dads run out of the living room when the church shows up with Christmas presents because we care about the kids. Remember, there's no bad people here. But I've had dads talk to me and said, "Why do you always have to be a hero in my house?" And so what some folks have done, and it's not this simple, but there have been efforts then, how do you help the families be able to provide for their children in those places? And it's not a purely one or the other. But if you're not willing to at least ask the question, okay, is there a way for us to get these resources to these kids through their parents? And if there is, it's going to be more complicated. And I'm not suggesting that the kids should suffer until we figure it out. But until we can, at the very least, wrestle with a better way would be, maybe how do we do both and? How do we begin to explore to do both? How can we work with partners that are doing those things? Because truth of the matter is, you and I can't deliver those kinds of things long term. We just can't. We've got to work with an indigenous partner. Can we find an indigenous partner that's doing both? Can we support an indigenous partner that's doing those things and say, we'll resource you in that sort of way? I told Fred, he said, there's one thing you got to promise, so you'll be done at 7:30. And I said, evangelistically speaking, we will. So I'm going to say a quick prayer and we'll be done on this. So God, thank you for this group, for the time together. I pray that you would help us as we kind of look through this some more over the next couple of weeks. And Lord, put in our hearts what it is that you would like to see us do as a church. Open our eyes. In Jesus' name, amen.